Current world champion Magnus Carlsen has been king of chess for nearly a decade now, but there's an 18-year-old superstar on the rise, and that man is Alireza Firouzja, and for me, he's the only player that Carlsen truly fears in modern times, and in this game we'll really see why. So this was played in the Gold Money Asian Rapid tournament. Firouzja had the white pieces, Magnus had black, and it's amazing how Firouzja takes the fight to Magnus here. So we had pawn to e4, pawn to e5 from Magnus, knight c3 now, so Magnus goes knight f6, we have bishop to c4 now, bishop to c5, pawn to d3, pawn d6, and now Firouzja goes f4, so a kind of delayed king's gambit, and this is known as the Vienna game. Now you immediately might be wondering, well, what if black goes knight g4 here, attacking f2? And there's a very aggressive way for white to respond. It gets very tactical. So white can actually go f5 here. And if black jumps in, then we have queen to h5, threatening mate in 1. And after the logical g6, we play queen into h6. And there's multiple threats here basically. If black takes the rook, then we can play something like bishop to g5. We can also slide the queen in at some point. So it's a very dangerous position for black, and Magnus just didn't even want to go in for these tactics. So instead of this, Magnus just plays a developing move here, knight to c6. We had knight to f3 from Firouzja, pawn to a6 from Magnus, giving his bishop an escape square. We had bishop to b3 now from Firouzja, pawn to h6, queen to e2 now, developing onto these light squares and getting out of the way so that the king can castle soon. We had bishop to g4, pinning this knight, trying to fight for this d4 square inadvertently. And now Firouzja takes in the centre. We note that he's exhausted all of his good developing moves at this point. He wants to play bishop to e3, but if he does it straight away, then the pawn can take here and we've lost the tempo. So he first resolves the centre tension, pawn recaptures, and now bishop to e3. And Magnus now jumps in on d4, occupying this powerful square. And we don't want to take this knight with our bishop because this dark square bishop is just so important in this position. So Firouzja slides across to f2. We now have bishop takes on f3 from Magnus. And again, this is all part of a strategy of fighting for d4 here. So that's why Magnus chops bishop for knight in this position. Firouzja recaptures, and now we have knight h5. So we can see Magnus fighting for these dark squares immediately. Firouzja castles queenside, knight comes into f4, and now king to b1, a tidy and standard defensive move. So Magnus now chops the bishop on b3. He doesn't have to do this, but he simplifies to a position here where he thinks he can outplay Firouzja in an endgame. So Firouzja now takes on c5. He doesn't really want to recapture this knight because after bishop takes, queen d4, black has a big grip on these dark squares, and if we take, this looks horrible, all of white's pieces are cramped. If we retreat the queen or defend it with, say, rook d to e1, then black just has a big positional advantage here with a lot of dominant pieces. So that's why Firouzja first takes on c5 here, knight recaptures, queen recaptures, and Magnus plays queen to d6. That queen's just too powerful on c5, left unchallenged. Firouzja now swaps, he doesn't have too much better, pawn recaptures. So now that the smoke has cleared, we can see that we're in an endgame, and although the position is equal, we know how strong Magnus is in endgames, so Firouzja really has his work cut out here not to misstep. So he first plays pawn to d4, a natural move, breaking in the centre, trying to open the line of his rook. We had castles queenside from Magnus, and now rook to d2, perhaps preparing to double, also defending along the 7th rank. Knight to e6 now, a nice retreating move from Magnus and putting a question to Firouzja as to how he wants to play. He drops the knight back into e2, Magnus activates his h-rook, preparing f5, and now Firouzja actually decides to close the centre. He kicks this knight away, and he also has plans of advancing these queenside pawns now that the centre has closed. So Firouzja first plays the rook into d3 to defend this pawn, and now although Magnus wants to push f5, he first takes a time out to go knight h3, a really nice positional move here because we note that if he went f5 immediately, after h4, this knight has to stumble back to h7. So that's why he jumps in on h3. we have rook to c1 from Firouzja, so he abandons this pawn and tries to prepare counterplay on the queen side, and this is where he has a brilliant instinct for counterplay and creating tactical positions where he's so strong. Magnus goes f5 now, Firouzja goes pawn c4, we had f takes on e4, pawn recaptures, and now rook to f2, so we can see that Magnus has now got the better of it in this endgame. He's invaded on the 7th rank, and his knight is more active here, looking at this dark square. Firouzja now goes knight to c3, probably not the best. He should arguably take here, and after rook recaptures, play something like c5 to try and generate counterplay. But this is what Firouzja does really well. By keeping the knights on the board, he does keep the position complicated and keep Magnus guessing. So Magnus chops the h2 pawn, we have pawn to c5, knight into f4 hitting the rook. The rook comes back to d1. The problem with coming to the g file here is black just goes g5. So after rook d1, which is more flexible, Magnus now takes a time out to improve his king with king to b8. We have pawn to c6, undermining these light squared pawns. Rook to c8 now, coming onto that dangerous file, and knight to a4. So here comes the counterplay which Firouzja is trying to generate with this knight, and knights are so dangerous in rapid play games, of course. So rook to e2 now from Magnus, going after this e pawn. We have knight to b6 hitting the rook, rook to c7, knight to d7 check, king to a7, and now rook to c4, defending this pawn in the centre. h5 now from Magnus, so this is the challenge for Firouzja. This pawn is quickly coming down the board. It's also a passed pawn with its brother on g5, so Firouzja has to generate counterplay fast, and I love how he does that in this position. So rook to g1 now, hitting that g pawn, and really Magnus should have just ploughed on here with pawn to h4. He takes this time out to go g6, but it's a valuable piece of time that he shouldn't lose. Firouzja now plays a4, turning the tables on Magnus with the counterplay. We had pawn to h4 and now pawn to b4. The king is coming under fire. There's a threat here of b5 and then b6, checking the king, taking the rook, supported by the knight, that dangerous knight that Firouzja didn't swap off. So we have pawn to b6 from Magnus, trying to react to that. Pawn to b5 now, and Magnus closes with pawn to a5. But what this sequence of moves has done is create a really powerful passed pawn on c6 and tied down this rook. So we now had a beautiful shot from Firouzja taking advantage of that, and if you want to pause and have a look, then please do so. We have knight takes on e5, and the pawn can't recapture here because otherwise we go d6 and these pawns are deadly coming down the board from the 6th rank. So instead of that, Magnus plays h3 here, getting on with pushing his passed pawn. We had rook to h1 coming in front of that, and now knight takes d5 from Magnus, a counter tactic, because if the pawn recaptures, we take this knight here. So instead of doing that, Firouzja played knight takes on g6, Magnus goes knight e3, hitting this undefended rook. We had rook to c3 now, knight to g4, knight to f4 now from Firouzja, hitting rook and pawn, and this is where Firouzja's now started to take over. So the rook captures this pawn in the centre, knight jumps into d5, hitting this rook. Magnus counterattacks on Firouzja's rook in the corner here, but Firouzja calmly plays knight takes on c7, and after knight takes on h1, rook takes on h3, Magnus actually resigned here, and it's certainly not premature because after knight h2 we can actually play rook to h8, and there's a threat of checkmate here which can't be stopped. And if the black king tried to counterattack on the white knight, well then we go knight to a6 check, and after that we've got the same checkmate threats coming down the board here. So it will be fascinating to see how this rivalry between the two great players unfolds over the years. If you enjoyed this video, then hit subscribe here, and if you want to see more Firouzja videos, click here. Thanks very much for watching, and see you soon.